Red alert, U.S. military vessel deployment concerns Venezuelan regime. Impactful opening. The morning of August 21st, 2025, dawned differently in Caracas, in the corridors of the Miraflores Palace. The atmosphere of tension was palpable. Nicolas Maduro convened an emergency meeting with his high military command, and the reason was crystal clear. American warships were moving dangerously close to Venezuelan territorial waters. What seemed to be a routine military operation quickly transformed into one of the most delicate moments in relations between Washington and Caracas since the rise of the Chavista regime. But how did we reach this critical point? What is really happening in Caribbean waters? And what are the real implications of this military movement that has kept diplomats and international analysts on maximum alert? Prepare yourself, because you are about to dive into an in-depth analysis of one of the most sensitive geopolitical crises of the moment, where each naval movement could determine the future of an entire region. The explosive context. To understand the magnitude of this naval crisis, we need to go back in time and understand the deep roots of the conflict between the United States and Venezuela. For decades, bilateral relations oscillated between cooperation and confrontation, but it was with Hugo Chávez's rise to power in 1999 that the abyss began to deepen irreversibly. Chávez's Venezuela represented everything Washington feared: an openly anti-imperialist Latin American government with vast oil reserves and growing regional influence. When Nicolas Maduro assumed power in 2013, he inherited not only the Chavista legacy, but also a collapsing economy and a country plunged into an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. Millions of Venezuelans fled the country, creating one of the largest migration crises in recent Latin American history. The United States, in turn, intensified economic sanctions, froze Venezuelan assets abroad, and promoted growing diplomatic isolation. The recognition of Juan Guaido as interim president in 2019 marked the apex of this maximum pressure strategy. However, Maduro resisted, supported by powerful allies like Russia, China, and Iran, transforming Venezuela into a focal point of global geopolitical tensions. It is in this cauldron of conflicting interests that we must situate the current American naval movement. This is not an isolated event, but rather the latest chapter in a rivalry that has its roots in fundamental issues of power, resources, and regional influence. The operation in detail. According to Pentagon sources and intelligence agency reports, the American naval movement near Venezuela is not just a routine show of force. It is a carefully planned operation involving multiple state-of-the-art warships, including Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, frigates, and logistical support vessels. The USS Thomas Hudner, one of the most modern destroyers in the American Navy, was identified navigating approximately 200 nautical miles from the Venezuelan coast, a distance that, although in international waters, represents a proximity considered provocative by regional diplomatic standards. Accompanying this main vessel, other naval units form what military specialists classify as an expeditionary battle group, capable of projecting significant military power in the region. The official American justification for this movement is multifaceted. First, Washington authorities claim to be conducting anti-narcotics patrol operations, since Caribbean waters are known routes for international drug trafficking. Second, they mention routine naval exercises designed to maintain fleet operational readiness. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, they claim to be protecting American national security interests in the region. However, independent military analysts suggest that the real objectives of this operation go far beyond public justifications. The proximity of vessels to Venezuelan oil installations, combined with political timing of the operation, indicate a psychological pressure strategy designed to demonstrate American capability to disrupt Venezuelan economic operations if necessary. Regime reaction. Caracas' response to the American naval movement was immediate and forceful. Nicolas Maduro, in an emergency televised address, denounced what he classified as an unacceptable imperialist provocation and ordered maximum alert status for Bolivarian National Armed Forces. The Venezuelan dictator spared no words in characterizing the American naval presence as a direct threat to national sovereignty, and promised to respond with all necessary force if Venezuelan territorial waters were violated. Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez complimented the presidential declarations by announcing the mobilization of their own naval units to monitor and respond adequately to the American presence. Although the Venezuelan Navy is significantly inferior in capacity and technology compared to the American one, Caracas counts on other resources that could complicate any military escalation. Venezuela possesses coastal defense systems supplied by Russia, including medium-range anti-ship missiles capable of striking vessels in international waters. Additionally, the country has developed an asymmetric military doctrine that emphasizes naval guerrilla tactics and the use of smaller, more agile vessels to harass larger naval units. Even more concerning, diplomatic sources report that Caracas activated emergency communication channels with Moscow and Beijing, requesting political and potentially military support should the situation deteriorate further. The presence of Russian and Chinese military advisors in Venezuela adds a dangerous international dimension to any potential conflict. Geopolitical implications. The current naval crisis between the United States and Venezuela transcends far beyond a simple bilateral dispute, representing a microcosm of contemporary global geopolitical tensions. For Washington, Venezuela under Maduro represents a multifaceted threat to American interests in the region, beyond national security issues related to drug trafficking and irregular immigration. There is strategic concern about the growing influence of rival powers like Russia and China in America's geopolitical backyard. Russia, in particular, has used Venezuela as a platform to project military power in Latin America, sending strategic bombers, warships, and advanced defense systems to the South American country. This Russian presence on Venezuelan territory represents a clear violation of the modern Monroe Doctrine and constitutes a direct challenge to American hegemony in the region. China, for its part, has invested billions of dollars in the Venezuelan economy through oil-guaranteed loans, creating an economic dependency that Beijing can exploit for its own geopolitical purposes. The combination of Russian and Chinese influence in Venezuela creates an anti-American axis that extends from the Caribbean to the heart of South America. For neighboring countries, the escalation of tensions between Washington and Caracas represents a complex diplomatic dilemma. Brazil, Colombia, and Guyana find themselves in the delicate position of balancing their relations with the United States, their main commercial and security partner, with the need to maintain regional stability and avoid a conflict that could have devastating humanitarian consequences. The international community also watches with growing concern the developments in the region. The European Union has advocated for a diplomatic solution to the Venezuelan crisis, but recognizes that military escalation could force a re-evaluation of its stance. Multilateral organizations like the OAS and UN have called for restraint from all parties, but their capacity to influence events remains limited. Military analysis. From a purely military standpoint, the potential confrontation between American and Venezuelan naval forces presents an overwhelming imbalance in favor of the United States. The American Navy possesses technological, logistical, and operational capabilities that surpass by several orders of magnitude anything Venezuela can mobilize. However, this disparity does not necessarily guarantee a simple or predictable outcome in case of confrontation. Venezuela has developed a military doctrine based on so-called asymmetric warfare, which emphasizes the use of unconventional tactics to maximize the impact of inferior forces. This strategy includes the employment of fast boats armed with anti-ship missiles, sea mines, and coordinated attacks using multiple small platforms against larger individual targets. Additionally, Caribbean geography favors a defender with its relatively shallow waters, numerous islands, and narrow passages that can be exploited for ambushes and surprise attacks. Venezuela can also count on support from irregular militias and armed groups operating along the extensive Caribbean coast. The most concerning factor, however, is the possibility of conflict internationalization. The presence of Russian and Chinese military advisors in Venezuela, combined with weapon systems supplied by these powers, could result in an incident directly involving other nuclear powers. a Russian missile operated by Venezuelan personnel that struck an American vessel could create a diplomatic and military crisis of incalculable proportions. The economic factor behind all the diplomatic rhetoric and military posturing lies an economic reality that cannot be ignored: oil. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, with approximately 300 billion barrels of crude oil. This energy wealth represents both an opportunity and a threat to American interests in the region. For decades, Venezuelan oil fueled the American economy and provided substantial profits for American oil companies. However, with the deterioration of bilateral relations and the imposition of economic sanctions, this energy flow was practically interrupted. The loss of access to Venezuelan oil forced the United States to seek more expensive alternatives in other markets, impacting domestic fuel prices. For Venezuela, the interruption of oil exports to the United States represented an economic catastrophe, with its economy dependent almost exclusively on oil revenues. The country plunged into an unprecedented economic crisis, with hyperinflation, shortage of basic products, and collapse of public services. This desperate economic situation made Maduro's regime even more dependent on support from allies like Russia and China. The American naval movement near Venezuela can be interpreted as an attempt to further pressure the Venezuelan economy, demonstrating American capability to disrupt maritime commercial routes connecting Venezuela to its international markets. This indirect economic pressure may be more effective than formal sanctions, since it affects the confidence of commercial partners and international investors. Possible scenarios. Analyzing the current situation, several possible scenarios emerge with the evolution of this naval crisis, each with distinct implications for regional and global stability. The first and most likely scenario is gradual de-escalation, where both parties recognize the risks of direct confrontation and choose to retreat from their most aggressive positions. In this scenario, American vessels would eventually move away from waters near Venezuela, while Caracas would reduce the alert status of its armed forces. A second scenario involves the institutionalization of tension, where American naval presence becomes permanent or semi-permanent, creating a state of continuous confrontation that does not evolve into open conflict, but keeps the region in a state of chronic instability. This scenario would be particularly harmful to the regional economy and could result in accidents or incidents that escalate involuntarily. The third scenario, and the most dangerous, is escalation to direct military confrontation. This scenario could be triggered by a naval incident, miscalculation, or deliberate political decision by either party. A military confrontation between the United States and Venezuela would have devastating consequences not only for both countries, but for the entire Caribbean and South American region. There is also the possibility of fourth scenario, where the naval crisis serves as a catalyst for regime change in Venezuela. Military pressure combined with economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation could weaken Maduro's regime sufficiently to allow political transition. However, this scenario would depend on internal Venezuelan factors that are difficult to predict or control externally. Humanitarian consequences, often neglected in geopolitical analyses. The humanitarian consequences of the current naval crisis are profound and lasting. Venezuela already faces one of the worst humanitarian crises in the Western Hemisphere, with more than 7 million Venezuelans having left the country in recent years. Military escalation could dramatically exacerbate the situation, creating new waves of refugees and internally displaced persons. Neighboring countries, particularly Colombia, Brazil, and Guyana, already face enormous challenges in absorbing existing Venezuelan refugees. An additional military crisis could completely overwhelm their humanitarian response capabilities, creating regional social and political instability. Within Venezuela itself, the civilian population will be most affected by any military confrontation. The country's infrastructure, already in precarious condition due to the economic crisis, could be further damaged by military actions, prejudicing access to basic services like water, electricity, and medical care. The international humanitarian community has expressed grave concern about the possibility of further deterioration of the situation in Venezuela. Organizations like the International Red Cross and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees have appealed for all parties to prioritize civilian protection and keep humanitarian routes open. The role of diplomacy. Amid bellicose rhetoric and military shows of force, diplomacy remains the only viable tool for a lasting resolution of the Venezuelan crisis. However, diplomatic channels between Washington and Caracas are practically broken, with communication limited to hostile public declarations and positioning through third parties. Various international actors have tried to mediate the conflict, including countries like Norway, Mexico, and Uruguay, which maintain relatively cordial relations with both parties. The European Union has also offered its good offices to facilitate constructive dialogue. However, the fundamental positions of Washington and Caracas remain irreconcilable, hindering any significant diplomatic progress. The question of political legitimacy remains the central obstacle to any diplomatic solution. The United States continues to recognize Juan Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate president, while Nicolas Maduro maintains effective control over Venezuelan state institutions. This fundamental dispute over who legitimately represents Venezuela makes any direct negotiation extremely difficult. Multilateral organizations like the OAS and UN have tried to create forums for dialogue, but their initiatives have been limited by political polarization and lack of genuine political will from the main parties. The current naval crisis only adds urgency to the need for diplomatic solutions, but also further complicates possibilities for constructive dialogue. Conclusion and final reflections. The naval crisis developing in Caribbean waters represents much more than a simple dispute between the United States and Venezuela. It symbolizes the fundamental challenges of contemporary international order, where rival powers compete for influence in an increasingly multipolar and unstable world. For the United States, this crisis represents a crucial test of its capacity to maintain regional hegemony in the face of growing challenges from powers like Russia and China. The American response to the Venezuelan situation will be watched closely by allies and adversaries around the world, influencing perceptions about American determination and capability. For Venezuela, the survival of Maduro's regime may depend on its ability to navigate this crisis without provoking a military confrontation that would be clearly lost. Add